Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hi, I'm Charles Galda. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast. Jesus tells us that when the church is in unity, that people will know that he is God's son, and that when we do good works, the world sees it and the world praises God. So we believe that concepts like unity, concepts like disadvantaging ourselves to serve other people and do good works are evangelistic. And so our focus then focuses on making disciples our podcast focuses on making disciples because those are people who can live in unity with each other. Those are people who are willing to disadvantage themselves to serve others. So we talk about making disciples, we talk about doing justice, good works, we talk about sharing Jesus. Today, we're going to do something, I seem to say a lot, we're going to do something a little different. Today, we're going to do something I think a lot different. And so we're going to talk about politics. Now, before you tune out, just bear with me for a minute. In my Christian tradition, we don't talk about politics much. And I think that may be a mistake because what we're seeing happen is that we're leaving the field empty to other people who may not come at issues from a biblical framework. And then they get to dominate that debate, and we're missing the boat on it. And we don't get the opportunity to harness the power of the gospel, harness the power of prayer, harness the power of a united church to really change society and transform society. And so we want to clarify there's a difference between politics and partisanship. Partisanship seeks to advance the position of one side, to discredit the other side, to argue that side is evil. We see that in our culture a lot. We think that's toxic. We think it's dishonest. We think it seeks to dehumanize. We don't want to be part of that. But politics seeks to persuade and implement policies that are just, that are fair, that provide the greatest good for the most people, knowing that when we talk about these issues, and we apply a biblical framework, we may arrive at a position where we agree. We may arrive at a position where we disagree. And that's okay, as long as we're doing it in love and respect. That's what abolitionists did. They didn't all agree, but they applied a biblical framework to the issue of slavery and fought slavery. That's what happened in the civil rights eras for churches that engaged in fighting for civil rights. That's what we do today when it comes to issues like abortion, human trafficking, gender and sexuality, religious liberties. But for some of us, those issues kind of get carved out, and we'll talk about the politics of them. Other issues we don't, maybe because we think they're more divisive. I'm not really sure the root cause there. But what we see happening, though, is in those issues where we're not talking about it, we land on positions sometimes that don't get run through a theological lens or a biblical lens. And we want to experiment with expanding the topics we talk about. And so today we're going to start with the minimum wage. And if we have time, we're going to try and get to education, but I don't know whether we will. Now, I know some of you are going to disagree, and that's okay. My guess is on the panel we have here today, and I'll introduce them in just a moment, we won't all agree. So I'm going to assume if we all agree, one of us you'll disagree with one of us. The truth is, we know that truth is exposed when we engage with people we disagree with. That's what Proverbs talks about with the concept of iron sharpening iron as part of what Paul is getting at when he tells the Bereans to test things against Scripture. And so we want to be doing that. So I've asked two friends who are being pretty gutsy and helping us with this experiment to be with us. The first is the Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond of Bethel AME in Jamaica Plains. And some of you will recognize Pastor Hammond. He's been with us before, and I'm sure, I hope, will be with us again. And Pastor Enoch Liao, who's from Boston Chinese Evangelical Church, which is a multi-campus church in the Boston area. And I hope this is Enoch's first time. I hope you'll be back, Enoch. But guys, thanks for being with us today. I appreciate it.
Great to be here.
Great to be here.
Let me just set the table a little bit, just in case folks haven't been following this debate around the minimum wage. So today, the federal minimum wage is set to $25 an hour. 29 states have set something higher than that. Conversely, 21 have not. 40 localities have set something different than that, as high as $15 an hour. There's a push right now in the current COVID bill to adopt a nationwide 15 mile an hour, $15 minimum wage that will get phased in over 4 years. So a little more than double for places that are using the federal minimum wage, not for places who are already above it, of course. It phases out the concept of a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, for youth and the disabled, which some states will have. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that 900,000 people will be lifted out of poverty with a $15 minimum wage, and 1.4 million people will lose their jobs. The Progressive Economic Policy Institute has a study where they say 32 million people would benefit from a higher minimum wage or a $15 minimum wage. Some will counter that by raising the cost of something without increasing productivity means you won't see the stimulative effects that they've built into their model. One study says that only 13% of minimum wage workers live in poor households. 2/3 live in households that are at 2 times the poverty level. 40% of minimum wage workers live in households of 3 times the poverty level. So there's a whole bunch of different pieces of data that go along with this conversation. And some of it conflicts with each other. In fairness, that happens in the marketplace. President Biden does support this, and the bulk of the supporters in Congress are Democrats. There's a piece in the Wall Street Journal today where some Democrats are starting to question whether or not the nationwide one will actually be something they can support, but we'll see how that plays out. But to start, let's start where I think we probably always should start, is frame this up for us theologically, if you guys would. How should Christians come at an issue like the minimum wage? Why should we care about the minimum wage at all? Ray, can I ask you to maybe start us out?
Sure. A couple of things that for me I think are really critical, and thanks again for raising this. I think the point that you made earlier is key. They come at it humbly. They come at it from a posture that says, we are trying to wrestle with complex issues. Answers are not immediately apparent. There are dueling studies. There are dueling worldviews. And even if we Christians could agree on something, which I highly doubt, I was first told this by my Jewish friends, and I think it applies to Christians as well. Put 2 of them in a room and you got 3 opinions, right? So I think this is, even if we could agree, we live in the context of a democratic system with people who wouldn't agree with that. And we've got to work through living together. That means we got to bring, I think, what I would call a level of humility to the exercise that says, it's not my way or the highway. So that's the first thing that I think is crucial. The second of which I think is to understand that the issue of paying the worker fairly, treating the worker fairly, is not a Democratic or Republican issue. It's a biblical issue. It starts in Leviticus 19 and it doesn't stop till James 5. And so this notion of the importance. Now, the Bible doesn't tell you what fair is, right? But it says you should be striving to figure that out and then do it. The second thing I think that's really important is that says to me that this isn't primarily a market function, it's a moral function. And again, that doesn't prescribe answers, it just tells us that it's important to God, and as believers should be important to us. A third thing for me is that the discussion among Christians is, what's the kind of worldview that we bring to it? I think by and large in the world, we're operating with an ownership viewpoint. I think the biblical model is more like a trusteeship, stewardship model. I don't just own what I have and I'm free to dispose of it in whatever ways I can. I have to take other things into consideration, other moral and biblical considerations. And then, of course, that gets down to the issue of what's the process by which we try to figure out what's fair and for whom is it fair, and how do we address other impacts. There's no policy I've ever come across that did not have no human policy I'm aware of that doesn't have a downside to it. How do we address that downside?
So negative consequences. My undergraduate degree is in economics, so we would always talk about an unintended consequence.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Enoch, how do you think about it?
Well, thanks for having me. And perhaps my only qualification here is that I'm totally not an expert in these issues. So maybe a lot of your audience is also not an expert, but trying to wrestle with these things. So far, I don't have anything to really give you an example of disagreeing. I totally agree with Reverend Hammond's points about all those things. To build on top of them, I would say one of the things that is really hard theologically is if we approach this from the standpoint of loving someone else, I think we have to get out of this notion where we design a policy that is best for me, or in our government system, best for my constituents. That is tough when it comes to policy, because I think people in an elected system have pragmatic, practical, and perhaps even ethical duties to represent their constituents. But in the Church of Christ, I think it's less about representing constituents and doing what is good for the most. And you could call this a bias, because I think this is biblical in the Old Testament, the idea that if there is a bias, it's in the Old Testament, the big four categories, I think, would be the widows, the orphans, the foreigner, and the prisoner. So I do think, in our preaching, we have said that God seems to have a bias towards them, not in a negative sense, but in that sense of, I think we need to skew towards them in general. The other thing I'd like to point out biblically is to help people think through what is the definition of rich and poor and wages. There's a rich thing, Reverend Hammond already mentioned some of this, but in the Old Testament, the idea that there were some people that if they worked, you had to pay them upon that day. The biblical basis of that was because they didn't have savings. So if you didn't pay them, they did not eat. Thus, it was incredibly unjust to not pay them that day's wage, which might be some of the more biblical sort of themes where you could base the concept of a quote unquote a living wage. And that's the same thing of like, if they only have one cloak, you got to give it back to him, because that's literally the only clothing they have. And that's what they're going to literally sleep in today. So there is, even though, one can quibble about the economic and political system of the Old Testament, like Ray said, there are so many theological and moral principles rich in the Old Testament that I think would deeply inform a Christian today about how to approach minimum wage. So love, understanding, a bias and preference to those that are the weak, the poor, or the outcast, and really a deeper understanding of Scripture and the Old Testament would probably be the places I'd start if we had time to unpack all that.
And so it's a good point. So when we talk about the law, sometimes we'll focus a little bit heavily on the sacrificial system and things like that, but there's a whole economic and legal system.
Absolutely.
Representative law that makes that, I got this great point of, here's how you pay your workers, right? The law, the government, right? Because that was intended to be the government of Israel. The law gets very specific about economic issues like that. So that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. What I heard you guys saying in this is there's at least three principles I picked up. One is it needs to be fair. And Ray, to your point, but the Bible doesn't tell us fair, but we need to figure out fair. But you also mentioned, Ray, we have an obligation to figure out what's fair. So that from your perspective, which you're speaking biblically, of course, but from your perspective on that, I don't get to say, hey, well, look, I don't make the minimum wage. It's not my problem.
I believe that's the case. I mean, I think on any number of grounds, whether you look at, and it's last book, Enoch pointed out, I think again, so the Levitical framework and other parts of the law align beautifully with, the New Testament, which really talks about this important. How can you, if you see a brother or sister cold or hungry and you don't do something to address that, how can you say the love of God is in you? How can you say you love God whom you've not seen, and you don't demonstrate a loving approach to the needs of the brother or sister? You said they're very clear that those two are not compatible, and I think that's something as believers that we really do have to take to heart. The additional piece to that, in a democratic system, and this is the challenge we face, because the biblical writers didn't face it. They didn't operate in a biblical context. They didn't, for the most part, as best I know, elect, representatives who made the laws and the legislation. The question for us becomes, in that context, how are we then to exercise our call to do good to all people, especially those who are the household of faith, and to demonstrate, as Enoch talked about, that particular concern for people who are on the margins.
And so I hear fairness is an objective. I have an obligation to get involved with a mind towards fairness and a bias in what fairness means, to be favoring, and I'm using that word intentionally, the poor, the widow, the orphans, the immigrant. Am I saying it okay?
Yeah.
Enoch, you okay too?
Yeah, I think I would add one thing, because I think your audience wants us to disagree. So I'll
we haven't
into that.
got anything to disagree on yet, Enoch.
Yeah,
but okay, go ahead.
No, and actually, this is not really disagreeing. I'm just managing expectations, so people go, "Oh, that wasn't that big a deal." I don't actually think Ray would disagree or agree with necessarily, but I think when we talk about getting involved, I think it's easy for people to project getting involved in the way they think people should be involved. People that tend to care about this tend to project that. And I think I go back to John Stott and some of the early Lausanne documents about ways to engage socially. The example I think is sort of a classic one for sort of that Christian perspective coming in and helping people that are generally middle class. Understanding this is there's levels of helping, say, someone who doesn't have the money to buy, they have food insecurity. You'd be able to give someone some food or money. That'd be one level. Then there's a level in which you can support a program that helps feed people. Then there's a way in which you could help provide training for people to overcome whatever issues, finding a job or, mental health issues, to be able to get the stable job or deal with the issues that are preventing them from having the income. And then probably one of the larger, higher macro levels is you can engage in policy and advocacy. So when we say get involved, I think it's in the same way in the biblical framework of, in a local church, for example, some people are going to be on the front lines, and that's their calling. They may or may not know or even have a grasp of the policy issues because they're looking at stuff. And just like sometimes in policy talks, policy wonks, you just need to get down in real life. And I think it's about respecting all of those fronts, if you will, of battling the brokenness and sinfulness of our world. Because sometimes when someone says, hey, you're not involved in being, say, the process towards getting to a quote unquote fair minimum wage, what they really mean is you're not doing it at my level. You're not actually engaging in policy, which arguably is a very strategic, critical level. But then I don't know if everyone's there. So that's just one thing. So just to nuance the idea of we all have an obligation in that process somewhere. I'm not sure that we're all supposed to be at the policy level or that we're all supposed to be at the front lines, handing out meals to really minister directly. So just a little nuance.
And I agree. I think the challenge, again, and this gets back to, as I say, kind of our relatively somewhat unique in human history situation, is that we all tend to have at least one place to have some input. And as believers, I think we got to take it into account, and that's the voting booth. Now, again, there may be believers who decide, I don't want to vote. That's, and you're certainly free to do that in the U.S., not necessarily in other countries, but, that's your choice. So I'd agree with you, whether you decide to be involved in the policy or you just want to feed people, you just want to house people or clothe people, or give to have that done. The one place that we all, to some extent, I think, have to really think about this is as we come to the voting booth in a democratic system and elect representatives.
And I'm pretty snarky. I think you guys know me now. So I'm pretty snarky when folks say they don't vote. My answer is always, hey, that's fine. Don't worry about that. It's not like anybody died that you should have that right. So, and I want to come back to that concept because there is an aspect of the minimum wage of, I think this is important, therefore you should do this. But before we get into that piece of it, help me out with, where do you guys land on $15 national minimum wage? Based on that construct you just gave us, where do you land? Enoch, you're smiling, so you have to go first.
No, I'm smiling because I'm hoping that your camera's not on me. Honestly, this is, if you know me or my church, I infuriate people when they come in for pastoral counseling because I rarely give them an answer, partly because I honestly don't know 99.9% of the time, maybe 99.8% of the time. But I also think it's very nuanced. So I guess what I would say is I realize having the conversation is important, and whether I can actively engage in it and read everything I want to or not, I don't want to ever put down an issue because I think God gives people different causes and burdens to work on that. For myself, honestly, at this point, what I would say is I honestly don't know. That's how I am until we have to vote. Only when it comes on the ballot do I go, okay, I have to vote one way or the other. And that's when I try to do my best to wade through the resources. I will say, though, that I am, now we're going to get into, this is the part where you're never going to ask me back. When I listen to people talk about why they want the minimum wage, honestly, the most powerful voices that speak to me is someone is struggling. One of the articles that we read preparing for this, I just want to be able to pay for like food for my kids. That is very powerful to me. It affects me. It makes me wonder, why don't we do more? But then very quickly, the limited economic background I have is I'm just not really sure that will lift them up in the long term. So for me, and this is going to be an easy go-to answer for any issue, the minimum wage issue has to be seen in a context of a larger suite of actions and implementations that we have to do as a society. And I just don't want to ever get so fixated on the minimum wage. So my honest answer is, I'm sure that's all for that, but I'm not sure it's going to help. I guess what I would do is I'd be wondering what the goal of that is and how it really works. I have a feeling that the minimum wage would look different in different places. So a federal minimum wage, I'm not sure how useful that is given the vast range of cost of living and other things. And as the concept of minimum wage, honestly, I struggle with that because my first economics class at UCLA, the professor really challenged us because I think most everyone thought, yeah, minimum wage is good because we are those high schoolers that were getting the minimum wage and we would have liked it when we were in high school when we started college. But the economics professor said, when you take out minimum wage, you remove someone's ability to underbid. So I'm going to share a story now really quickly because this might be the only thing I have to say about this whole thing. When you have a minimum wage and you take someone and an employer has to choose between two people and they're going to pay them the same, I'm concerned about what choice they're going to make now. Because I think the marginalized folks might be seen as quote unquote less desirable to have under your employment. So when you remove the ability to underbid those things, obviously there's a kind of a gross, abusive, oppressive, systemic, keeping down underbidding. But in the Chinese community, and I'm going to get in so much trouble for this, in the Chinese community, the way they do that is this. Literally, this is how conversations go at my church. Oh, we're getting contractors to blah, 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 do something in the work in the home for a project. Oh, really? And then we'll talk about this. Eventually I'll go, what kind of contractors? Regular contractors or, I'm going to say something, Chinese-ish contractors? And what in our context, what that means is people that don't pull permits really often. I'm going to get so much. There are a lot of people that follow all the regs and stuff. But one of the reasons why in our community, in Chinatown, and other places where Chinese contractors are cheaper is because for whatever reason, they don't know or they may not cross all their T's or dot their I's. And I'm not saying everyone does this, but there's definitely this stereotype, and I'm probably harmfully perpetuating it, where good work, but you're going to save money because it's going to be under the table and they're not going to regulate that. And in my mind, that is one of the unintended consequences when you set this up. And I don't know how to deal with it, but that's just something that's in my mind. So I'm not sure if it's really helpful. So turn over to Dr. Ray Hammond.
Yeah, no, let me say two things. One of which is there are those kind of contractors in every community that I know of, right? It is not a Chinese thing.
I know, but speaking
No, I hear you, right? Every community
we don't do it. We don't do it, but they exist. We hear of them.
That's right. They are out there. Because you're exactly right. This is a very human response to the way economy works. No question about it. That said, I would say I favor it as a very imperfect floor for all the reasons Enoch has started to talk about. On some levels, it just doesn't make sense entirely given the differences in the cost of living around the country. But as a floor, I think it makes sense. And I think it makes sense even though I accept that it will cost jobs.
Because of the good that you would see of the people who still have
absolutely,
right?
Not only the good that I see there, but looking at the past history of minimum wage changes, which have always cost jobs. My sense is, if you look at the best studies, over time, those things tend to kind of even out.
And so let me poke at the concept of a minimum wage, and then I want to come back to this view of what should it be. But the concept of a minimum wage, there is a piece of what I think Enoch said of, I think this is a societal good that we should have a minimum wage, and therefore you, employer, must pay the price for that. Isn't there a dishonesty in that? Shouldn't we say, well, look, there should be if we all agree there should be a minimum wage, then we all should bear the cost for it? Would you agree with that or disagree? Meaning that the government should give a tax.
Well, let me throw this out. That's not an unfair statement to make, but it's not necessarily consistent with what we do elsewhere. We believe that a certain minimum of hygienic and sanitation standards should be established before you can open up a restaurant and for you to maintain it. Even though that's going to cost you more. You got to put in a hot water dishwasher. You've got to have inspections from time to time. You can install this stove, but not that stove. You've got to have ventilation. You've got to have, et cetera, et cetera. We are laying down minimum standards because we think the ensuring of the safety of the public, who doesn't get to look behind all of what's going on, is a worthwhile commitment for the common good, and we put the cost of that on the owner, and we expect that they will pass it forward to the consumer, but there's a level playing field.
So, right? So there's a sense in which society is paying the cost.
That's exactly right. We're saying you're going to pay it. You're going to pay it in prices, but we think for your safety, for the safety of the unsuspecting, for the safety of those who don't have time to go back and find out if the kitchen is actually clean and rats are not running around in it, these minimal standards around sanitation should be enforced. And we will close you down as a private concern if you don't meet those standards. So again, I'm not saying I know enough to know what those standards ought to be. All right. I'm not saying I even know enough to say what the standard should be in terms of minimum wage. I'm not sure. I don't know for sure that $15 is the right amount, but I don't see that in some respects as any different. We do this with construction jobs. We say you have to have certain safety arrangements if you're going to employ people. People can't come and say, I will work for less for you, or you can pay me that wage and you don't have to put those safety things and I'll take care of myself. We don't allow that to happen. So we have this principle already, and I don't think it's unreasonable to say that there is a floor below which you are unfairly taking people's times or taking advantage of the fact that they have no other options.
And so some people may say, hey, well, Ray, those OSHA requirements are too burdensome and stuff like that. We may say, hey, well, look, we might not have it exactly right, but we probably all agree there's some level of minimum safety standards the government should enforce, even if we don't think we're doing a good job of it today.
And it wasn't always that way. Much of these standards we're talking about, we go back to the turn of the 20th century. The muckraking journalists, Teddy Roosevelt, a whole series of people who said, I don't want to be sold, sausage that contains the parts of workers who fell into the vat. You got to stop the machine, get the worker out, right? I don't want things that are contaminated being foisted on the public, and the market will not regulate that. The market's just not very good at that. So again, we've got this tension between what the market can do and the market can do well, and other things that I would say are moral, not market challenges.
And so you're willing, I'm going to ask this provocatively, so you're willing to deny me of my right to privately contract with Enoch as an employer to serve that societal good?
I would say, no, I wouldn't deny you of your right, but In the same way, I would say you and Enoch can't agree to operate an unsafe workplace.
But sorry, I'm flipping back to the minimum wage. So I can't contract with Enoch and say $10 an hour, Enoch.
Right, because what I'm saying, I'm operating under the rubric, and and again, obviously, reasonable people disagree on this, that there are minimums in terms of safety, that there are minimums in terms of financial reporting, minimums in terms of that there are minimums that the larger society can and should enforce for the good of all. And that runs across a gamut of things. And I believe minimum wage can be one of them.
Enoch, what do you think?
I came here to listen to Dr. Hammond and you talk. Actually, in the realm of concepts, I'm much more comfortable talking in terms of, like, I'm going to say something potentially also quite evocative. So as an example, I actually think the concept of a minimum wage, you can ground it biblically, not necessarily a federal one, but the concept is there's a minimum at which below that would be unjust and unfair and unbiblical and immoral. Now, obviously, in the Old Testament, a lot of that is rooted in love and loving your neighbor. For example, to give you kind of an evocative thing, take capital punishment, incredibly divisive. Actually, I think it's pretty clear in the Bible that capital punishment is a mechanism that God uses that has no bearing on whether I think the system of capital punishment in any particular country is remotely effective as a deterrent or to provide justice. That's not at all saying that. But I think to decide definitely no capital punishment, period, that's hard to make that case unless you say something like human systems are so corrupt that it's not worth taking that chance, which is an argument people make. So coming back down to what Ray is saying and the minimum wage, I think biblically the concept is there is a unit at which below you paying that, it's not fair, it's not just, it's not appropriate, it's wrong. As far as the quote unquote market going for that, I think in our marketplace of ideas and policy, there definitely is going to be people that are going to be fighting for that for different competing interests. There could be people fighting for a lower minimum wage to simply line their pockets, but there could also be people fighting for a lower minimum wage because of their economic understanding of how it will ultimately be better for society. I think when it comes to policy and government, whether it's public funds or private funds like foundations, I think the issue is, I guess in that sense, I want people to compete and I want those ideas to compete. So I'm more about like making sure that enough people have enough resources to argue about the process towards minimum wage and then to argue towards that number and how to set that number. That's one of the things I would do. It's like, so if someone asks me, what do you think? I want to read a well-regarded publication from one position. And then sometimes I can't find another publication from the other side. That really concerns me. And it's not even about whether that side that has the well-funded publication is whatever, progressive or conservative. I'm just nervous the fact that I don't have a well-researched, well-funded, articulate voice from the other perspective. So I guess from a standpoint of process biblically, I'm all for having a minimum wage. I think we can be humble about how that process goes. And I'd love for us to really get some of our most dedicated, bright minds, as well as I would say thoughtful Christians and Christ followers to also weigh in on that. So
I thought you were just like look at one Facebook posting and spout off about it.
That is faster in some ways. So that's when I say I don't know yet, it's because I haven't necessarily found enough of those things. Because honestly, one of my friends once said, and someone who did a PhD said, once you read 4 books, you know more than 99% of the population on any topic. You read 8, you can write a PhD. I mean, not to make light of it, but it doesn't take much to get pretty far. And so for people that are really in that world, I think one can dive deeply with the resources of the internet to get kind of, I think one can wade through the internet and try to find reputable resources and thinking. And again, maybe this is not so much issue of minimum wage, but the process. I would love it if those people that are fighting from different perspectives, they actually know each other and they respect each other. That honestly, to me, is really, that tells me that their level of discourse has come to a certain point that they can vehemently disagree, but they actually know each other respectfully, as opposed to a debate, like where they're just kind of poking at each other's positions or arguments. So I think having a minimum wage as a concept, meaning below this, you are taking unfair advantage of people. Absolutely. I think that's a probably fairly safe, modest biblical claim. That's hard to assail. As to what that number is, how to get there, and whether that should be federalized across the entire country or region, I think, I don't know. I definitely, it gets very technical very quick. Just so your audience knows, Charles gave us some articles. I tried to read all of them, but some of them got too much math for me. And I go, well, even if I read this, I wouldn't understand it really. So that's what I would say. I think the concept is clear. And I think the biblical value, because it's not a minimum wage. It's the fact that there are ways in which we pay someone so low, we are being unjust and immoral. And I think we need to acknowledge that.
And as a pure capitalist business owner, for example, that may not be my framework of how I come at this at all.
Yep.
But as Christians who exist in a free market capitalist society, that still needs to be ours.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for that, if I may say, I think that's why I agree with Ray. Capitalism is a powerful engine and a powerful tool. But I think we all know that it's probably not the best steering wheel, if you will, to carry that analogy forward. And so I think, now this gets into massive fiscal policy, but basically I do think I would like a diversity of ideas arguing and competing in the marketplace, and then trying to listen and distill those down to think about policy. So I'm for the concept of having corrupt people, because I think we're all sinners before God, someone helping us be accountable to, you must pay a minimum blank, whatever that is, or you must provide a minimum, whatever that is. It doesn't have to be a wage. It could be a combination of compensation of salary, income, as well as maybe health insurance or whatever. But I think my tendency as a sinner, and I think human society, if we don't provide some of those guardrails, I think history, I don't think anyone disagrees that history we would just take advantage of the poor and disenfranchised. So.
It works. Capitalism can do many great things, but if it's not tempered by, I think, the integrity, morality that we're informed by the Bible, that's where we see it breaks down, and it is exploitative and selfish. But here's my issue with the minimum wage, and so tell me how you guys think about this. Is I think the problem is setting a national one. I think the country is so diverse and so different, and cost of living is so different places. Wouldn't it make more sense to, if we're going to accept that there's going to be a minimum wage, now I'm okay with that. Ray, you convinced me. And so if we're gonna have one, wouldn't it make sense to peg it to an index related to the poverty level, so that, for example, it needs to be 2x the poverty level, and I don't know what the right number would be, but 2x or 1.5x or 1 times, or set it something where now in that area, it's going to be more reflective of. Go ahead, Ray.
No, I would agree with you. I don't know that politically works, and I wouldn't disagree with you at all. The cost of living in Charleston, West Virginia versus Boston, Massachusetts versus LA versus Atlanta or Vicksburg, Mississippi. I mean, we're looking at wildly different costs, no question about it. And it would make sense. I mean, and we haven't even gotten to the problems with the poverty calculations, right? As opposed to numbers that really try to look at self-sufficiency. But of course, all of that gets to, what do you think is fair? What do you think is enough? And so, once you get to a definition of that, the cost of that varies so much regionally, city versus rural, etc. So to be honest, I think the reason that it ends up being federalized and kind of set is it's just politically easier. Even though the government doesn't operate that way. I mean, if you get a reimbursement for the government for travel, right, for lodging, it's based on tables that are reflective of the area. But that's regulations that they can sort of pass, and there's no politics, there's no challenge to it. So I completely agree that setting it up in a way that's more reflective of a particular area's real cost of living would make a lot of sense. I just don't know that politically you could get it.
Now, if I argue that we should have, because I would argue for indexing, I'll call it that for lack of a better term. And I haven't heard anybody say it may be impossible to do. That's why I may not hear anybody saying that. But I would argue it would be more just to have a lower minimum wage for certain groups. And so I'll put the disabled there, right? Because it's going to be, because now I would want to incent people to hire disabled. Am I thinking about it wrong?
Here's this is a question. I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to this. This comes up for teenagers all the time with regard to summer work, right? Where the idea is, let's just get young people in, and I think it's a great idea. I think let's just get young people into the workforce and the experience of work and work habits and work experiences on, and that's a launching. I think you could certainly you could do that, particularly if you were certain that in fact the disabled had other mechanisms. As for example, here in Massachusetts, you can, as a disabled person, you can draw support from the state. That's probably not true necessarily in other states. So now your disabled become kind of a pool of lower wage labor. So you'd have to look at that, depending on what the situation is. I think in various states, I wouldn't be opposed to it at all, as long as ultimately you're not, in a sense, setting that group up.
Yeah, because in some cases, it depends on the disability, obviously. I don't mean to presume there's a monolithic disability thing that everybody has in common. But in some cases, that disability will mean the worker is less productive, or I may have more costs as an employer. And so now if I have to pay the same for someone who may be maybe more expensive or less productive, right now I'm going to Enoch's point, I'm not going to want to hire those people.
Exactly.
And so now they're disadvantaged. And so the idea is there needs to be, it would seem like there's some mechanism, and Ray, it sounds like you're saying something different in Massachusetts, but there needs to be some mechanism to equalize that, and to either then have a substandard minimum wage for disabled people that they can then get other income from the government, or have something where employers can get that cost offset, so that they're just as, or at least, or maybe more incentive to hire someone who's disabled. Would that be a fair? Now we introduce complexity in the system, but is that fair?
Right, and we do this, for example, in a different way. But some of the student, what's the term? I can't remember. Where we kind of subsidize student employment in school.
Work study.
Work study. Thank you very much. Right. So it supports the student. It gives the agency or whomever they're working with a worker at a lower rate in some respects, and so there are definitely places and spaces where I think we could do that, and we have done it. Again, I think it's just being careful that you're not unintentionally creating a sub-minimum wage workforce that ends up trapped,
being exploited. And Ray, I think you hit on a really good point about teams, because the biggest obstacle to getting your second job is not getting your first job.
There you go. Right? Absolutely.
Right. And so you never get on the first ladder of the job rung, and so you're stuck there forever. And we see there's some racial diversity in that too.
Absolutely.
Of higher African American, for example, unemployment rate amongst teens. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But if they never get on that first job, they're going to have a tougher time in life.
Getting to the second. That's right. Absolutely.
And so what would you say to someone who said, well, hang on a minute, the minimum wage has been $7.25 for a while, and up until COVID, we had 3 years where people at the lowest income levels were having nice increases in their salary. They were actually increasing their salaries at higher rates than people at higher income levels, which has been the first time that's been happening in ages. So that person might say, well, why don't we just continue to cut regulations, continue to restrict immigration, and let the market reward people with higher salaries than trying to force it.
Because for I don't know how many years it's been that there's been no real wage movement.
It's 10 or 20 years. It's been a while.
Yeah. So I don't want to put the poor at the vagaries of the market. I shouldn't have to wait 20 years before I get some access to what is a clearly expanding economy. I mean, we've got historic levels of both income and wealth inequality. This is, for me.
Well, just fine tune that for me a little bit, because it's not to suggest that somebody's been sitting at 725 for 20 years or however long the minimum wage has been, that because they've probably gotten raises over time.
Well, no, but I'm saying in this respect, the record over the past couple of decades, not just for the poor, but for the middle class, is terrible. They are not reaping the productivity benefits as the economy is becoming more productive. It is not flowing to the middle and the poor. So, and you know, as I say, I'm not alone in this. I think there are a lot of people who are saying, you know, we hear all of this trumpet over again. The next generation is very likely to potentially face a standard of living less than their parents for the first time in American history. So I appreciate what the market does. I also understand it is a very imperfect human instrument. And like all imperfect instruments of human beings, it has to be tempered, regulated, held accountable, as all human beings need to be. And I think it's really important, personally, for the church to never idolize the market. For me, it's just another form of idolatry. Markets are never perfect. Nothing human is perfect.
We can say the free market is better than communism, better than socialism. Not everybody would agree with that, but we can say free market is better than those systems. But that does not make it a perfect system.
Not at all.
That dispenses justice to all.
Absolutely.
Right.
That system has not been designed.
Yeah, we're
not by human beings.
Right.
Not by human beings.
But Jesus has to come back for.
That's exactly right. It has not been established by human beings.
And so, Ray, when you talk about the education levels, and Enoch, I'd love you to weigh on this too. But if you think about the education levels, the middle income, low income workers have not seen the increase. There's a direct correlation to that with education quality and levels. So does that, I'm going to be cynical now with some of our politicians, and I don't mean, well, maybe I do mean to be, because I'm pretty cynical at times, but is there an aspect of this that is, we're not going to fix education to make it so that those workers can get that rung on the ladder, can be more productive so that they can increase their wages? We're just going to use this blunt tool and increase wages and leave education alone. Am I being cynical if I say that? Enoch, what do you think?
Can you phrase that again? I'm not sure I follow that.
So the idea is, Ray was making the point that folks on the lower income scale, middle income scale, have gone a long time without seeing real wage growth. And real wage growth tends to be tied to your education level and quality. And so there's another way to fix this, and that would be to fix education, so that folks are becoming enter the workforce as more productive, can command a higher salary over time, and have those core skills to start out, which would take a long time, and some people would say it can't be done. And so are we then, instead of fixing the education system, which would help fix this problem, am I being cynical to say that instead of solving the real problem, we're just going to say, okay, we're going to have a national minimum wage to increase lower wage workers, as opposed to fixing the education system that would be helpful to them?
Oh, I see. I mean, I guess that maneuver would not just be education. It would be addressing any root causes of those issues. And education is another area, but there'd be much more. There'd be the mental health, wellness of those families and dynamics and all those other factors. So I think it's easy when someone doesn't like a policy to call it a blunt instrument or criticize that. And again, I think it has to come back to be a part of a larger strategy. So I think education has to be looked at, but everything has to be looked at. You know, again, I think a flourishing of people advocating passionately and intelligently, thoughtfully, knowing that these are not just important issues and academic concepts, but that these are people's lives, daily lives, and that the policies touch people in real life. So I would never want to discourage someone who's thinking about minimum wage. And I would not also accuse someone that, oh, you only care about minimum wage, you're not going to care about the other aspects of their lives. If I may go back though to the minimum wage concept, and then the other pieces is, I love nuance. That fascinates me. I always try to understand it a bit more, but I actually have a slightly different take when it comes to policy. And I think both you and Ray mentioned this. When you increase complexity to a system, I think there's a couple of problems. And this is not data-based, this is just me observing. When you increase complexity, you make it harder to actually achieve the goals of whatever that system is intended. Number one. Number two, you also increase the ability for people to abuse the system. Mm-hmm. I would actually probably, if we're going to do it as a practical, and I've got no studies, and so I'm just a regular Joe doing this, I think it's probably more simpler to administer and hold accountable just a number for a minimum wage. And let everyone, economists, advocates, just continue to debate about that number, as well as seek to address that from other means. It's sort of like, to be very kind of, not edgy, but kind of sensitive, is like masks. Sometimes our government does not recommends mask A, but not mask B. And so people think, oh, mask B must be bad or wrong. Actually, mask B is better. It's just that human error means most people won't wear mask B properly. So as a policy standpoint, we don't recommend you wearing mask B, because most of you will find it, you won't wear it properly. And they don't say that. It's just policy seems to me to be too difficult to be nuanced. I can't nuance it for my one church. Sometimes we're trying to talk about something in my little church that we know everyone personally mostly. So on a national level, or even at a state or even a municipality level, it's my general view that these are going to feel like blunt instruments, because to create that much complexity at a policy level is to see, I don't know, it seems too burdensome or too exploitive, opening itself to exploitation. So though I may not like the lack of nuance of a certain number, I think it's simpler. And I know there are some superficial negative reasons where, yeah, we got the number and that's it. And, some people might quibble with the simplicity of that. But I think for me, saying a number is simpler because it's easier to hold accountable. And again, just say, like Ray has been saying, that number is not perfect. That number is way off for certain places, but everyone can see that. And then that allows the conversation to go forward and go, okay, how do we make this federal number over there work here in our area in a just, and I would even say biblical way that honors one another. So from a standpoint, I think policy tends to have to be simple and kind of blunt and simplistic, only because the nuance will overcome it. And probably, it's what happens when really smart, highly technical people devise. Who writes the instruction manual, right? Is it the guy that the lady and the guy that designed it, or some regular person, right? We pay people to boil it down. And I think on a policy level, there's a difference between discussing at a highly technical academic policy level, and then there's a big difference between that and then realizing, okay, this is what data or science or the best minds have come up with, humanly speaking. But that is to translate that to a policy on a lot of people that people have to follow and understand. I think that's hard. So for example, differently abled or disabled people, like the optics of that, like can't pay them less. There's just no, politically, I don't see there's a way to do that without conveying the underlying concern that I think our friends in that community have, is that they are not capable. So maybe the work study concept would be, you get the same rate, but it's subsidized. But again, teenagers don't have that. Teenagers, the conception is that teenagers are full of energy and they're the future, they just don't have the experience. So yeah, even there, that's more nuanced than, no politician is going to say, yeah, let's pay disabled people less. That's just not going to fly, I think. And I think it will also likely send the wrong message. And I know you didn't say that, Charles.
Yeah. But in some states that does exist today.
Yes, no, I get it.
That's why I was picking up on it.
Yeah, and I think when you read about those states, that pains people. But I get it. And I think we have to always be careful to not read motivation into policymakers. The most productive people I found that I interact with in DC, not that I do a ton, but being in the city of Boston, I'm just in a lot more closer proximity to people that literally are going to DC. So it's like, I know them before they become a national spotlight. I think the most constructive people seem to be those that respectfully realize that people in this country want the best for this country. They just have wildly different ways to go about it. And I think that to me is one of the best ways to approach this topic among anything.
And Enoch, you hit on a key point that is part of where I always get reluctant when we start talking about government rules, because what happens is we say, okay, look, we're going to have a $15 minimum wage, right? And we all agree to do that. then we realize, you know what, that's not fair here, and it's not fair here, and it's not fair in this circumstance. So now we fix those three things. And then we realize, well, actually, the way we fixed this one created two problems over here and another problem over here. We fix those. And before you know it, we've got this labyrinth of rules that then, in this case, an employer is trying to navigate through.
Exactly.
And it just becomes impossible to do business.
That's exactly. Yeah. I would add the other piece too. You brought up the issue of education, which I think is really crucial, because it's hard to talk about any of these ideas, fairness, politics, etc., in a vacuum, as you've already pointed out. So, for example, I'm willing to accept that people are going to lose minimum wage jobs. That some of those jobs are going to be automated. So we're going to have more self-service checkout lines at the grocery store and fewer cashiers. I'm willing to live with that. And part of the reason I'm willing to live with that is because I think that's going to be true either now or later anyway. Just like we don't have toll takers anymore, right? And whether it's fast or slow, the likelihood is that we don't have people pumping gas anymore.
Bank tellers, right?
That's exactly right. So for me, the question becomes recognizing that as a society, out of I'd say both a combination of fairness, but also long-term thinking, productive, happy people, I think raise healthier families. I think they're more likely to be tax contributors. I think they're less likely to be engaged in crime. I think they're likely to have neighborhoods that are prospering, and the cities are better. Not perfect, but so we have, I believe, a vested interest in at least trying to figure out, both because it's the right thing to do, but I think it's also the smart thing to do. If people are going to be displaced, what are the options open to them? So if, as a consequence of a change in people are displaced, what might we do to help those folks find the jobs that are developing and that are available, and train them for them? What are the incentives we could have? And for me, again, this is not just a matter of doing the right thing, it's doing the smart thing. The second, and this gets back, we were touching potentially on this issue of education. The commitment, I think, to public education was based on the notion that an educated citizenry benefited the country. It benefited the country to have citizens who understood the issues that were there before them, and in their voting and in their through their representatives deciding policy, they were able to bring a knowledgeable approach to that. That it was in the interest of the country to have a workforce that's educated. And in a global economy where the competition is not the next state, it's Singapore, it's Malaysia, it's Bangladesh, it's Vietnam, it's China. It's not either good, I believe, or wise not to keep asking ourselves, how do we make the most of our educational systems and the educational development of every single citizen we've got? So this, for me, is never a matter of charity. It really is trying to think, how do we bring everyone along? Because it's in all our interest. Though we don't always see it that way. We think we're competing and fighting with each other. But I really do believe it's in all of our interest to move together.
It's a great point. I'd love to come back to education if we're able to do one of these again. And Ray, you hit on a great point that I think has bitten us on the NAFTA treaty from back in the 90s. It's hard to argue that NAFTA wasn't good economically for all three countries, but what we missed in it was dealing with the displaced workers.
We did not retrain them, and we should have. We
Yeah.
owed them that.
Yeah. And so communities died, jobs died, people were unemployed. And so I think and I'll charge myself, I'm not really an economist, but that's my background is, well, look, it's creative destruction. This is all good things for the economy, right? We don't have stagecoaches anymore. That's a good thing, right? And this is what happened, but we lost in that. But now what do you do with the people and communities that are impacted by this?
Absolutely.
And that's probably a piece we're missing in the minimum wage debate, because what I don't hear in the policy is we're going to go to a $15 minimum wage, and here's what we're going to do about workers who are displaced by that.
Absolutely.
Businesses who are displaced by that. It's a great point. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, hey, we're an hour. So last word, guys, anything?
Enoch?
I guess one of the thoughts as an example of education being a very important topic in and of itself relating to the minimum wage would be things like immigration or legal status. So one of the ways that makes it easier for an employer, or I should put this way, one of the things that makes undocumented people, as I understand it, very concerned about this is because, they don't feel like they can go to a regulator and say, I'm not getting the minimum wage, because they don't have that status. Or maybe they actually are afraid of getting deported, or they're afraid of those types of issues. So once we layer into that, then that's going to add a whole range of complexity. So I think the minimum wage, like any other topic, is always a topic that goes into other topics. And that's why at some level, I think it's why politicians, and they do have to have a platform, right? I think this is going to sound divisive, but I think it's really hard to be a one issue voter, because even if you love that one issue, there are other issues that actually affect that one issue in ways that we don't always realize it. So for the minimum wage, I think it's a worthwhile discussion. And I'm supportive of the concept of it. As like Ray said, it's not a perfect system, but I don't know what else to do to help people at some level that need this, unless we come up with a better way to address the unfairness. And it's like affirmative action. And in the Asian community, that's just, it's all over the place, right? And surprisingly so. And I guess in my view, I come from a very sort of background where I think that would have not been favored. But then I'm also looking at the situations like, well, what do you do instead? And I think it is tricky. So I appreciate this conversation, because I'll be right there to say none of these are perfect solutions, but what is the best solutions that we have? And I also agree, in times when you make a decision, the moral decision does cost us, right? But it's just like in business or in life, actually over time, I think the moral decision God blesses, not because of a prosperity theology, but because when you treat your workers with fairness, I believe that it actually is good business. I mean, that hopefully you're not treating them for fairness for your bottom line, but that's the nature of Christ's servant leadership. I mean, modern business management, based on Peter Drucker and other Christians, it's true servant leadership. And so I totally agree with Ray. This is good for large segments of society if we actually truly do. The moral thing costs us in the short term, and it's hard. But honestly, a society where everyone keeps their word, obeys laws, and looks out for each other, everyone's going to be flourishing better in a society like that than otherwise. So that's all I would have to say. Honestly, I'm sitting thinking, why was I on this call? I was hoping, Charles, you would have forgotten that I was here, but you remembered. So anyway, but it's great those are some random thoughts there. No last words.
That is a really important point, is the law is replete with, here's how you have to conduct yourself, do justice. And it always means you have to disadvantage yourself, whether that's gleaning or even paying every day means I have to, right? If I have to give you your cloak back, I run a risk now, you may not, right? It's always about somebody having to disadvantage themselves, which is what love is about, right? You can't love somebody without disadvantaging yourself in some way, shape, or form. But Ray, you get the last word then.
Well, I just appreciate that we're trying to wrestle with this, and I, as I said to Enoch, the voice of every generation is really important in this. I mean, really critical, so important. And I think part of what we're seeing here is God calling the church, and in many respects through the church, even our world, to think about things in new ways. And one of the blessings is, when you've been around for a while, you kind of know all the reasons for which it doesn't work or might not. But I think newer and younger generations are very open to trying to see things differently. And that's a blessing. And I think we're going to get the most when we really do find ways to blend old experience and wisdom with young energy and openness to change. And I hope that the church will be that'll be a place where the church really will let its light shine. That it will it will be a place where we're willing to look at things humbly. We're willing to look at things honestly, even when they challenge our own biases and comfortable worldviews. That will be a place at which we'll be willing to say, we serve a God who's doing a new thing. Now, I'm not saying every new thing out there is God's thing, but God's doing some new things. And what are those new things? And let's not be afraid of everything that may be new or different or challenging. So that's my deep hope for the church, particularly in this season.
Because to argue against that point is to argue we've gotten it perfectly up till now, which is
oh my gosh,
tough.
Yeah, so far from that, right?
Well, guys, thanks so much for being with us. Thanks for taking on a risky experimental kind of thing with us and for the prep work that went into it. But thanks for your ministries. You're both big leaders across New England, and I know you're busy, and I appreciate your time. But I'm grateful for what you're doing in Boston and New England. And so, thanks for being with us, and thanks for helping us see that we can come at something from a biblical framework and focus on the key things the Bible does tell us, like fair, non-exploitative, while maybe landing differently on what fair and non-exploitative means at the end of the day. So guys, thanks again. I'd ask our audience to pray for our guests, pray for Ray and Enoch, pray for Bethel AME, pray for Boston Chinese Evangelical, and pray about what you may have heard in this, that God might be wanting you to do differently, or think about differently, or approach differently. And so I'd also like to thank our producer, Bob Atherton. And our next podcast is March 4th, and we'll be talking to Gordon McDonald, who's the former senior pastor at Grace Chapel, chancellor of Denver Seminary, president of InterVarsity, chair of World Relief, author, coach, mentor. You all know him. And he'll be talking about what he describes as one of the most important things he's ever done in ministry. And so I think that'll be an interesting episode. So join us again. See you then.
Thank you for joining the podcast today. If you'd like to learn more about Vision New England and what God is doing in our region, check out our website at visionnewengland.org. We hope you'll join us next time for the Church in Action podcast.